And good. All right. So we're going to start all over again. I've done this many times, and here I come again. Good evening, all, and welcome to our last session of the webcast. Thank you for being here. Thankful for your presence in the chat. And it's been quite a journey for all of us these 6 weeks. We've learned so much together. We've pondered a lot. And to begin our session together, just want to put this short question in the chat to kind of start us off here. Put one word in the chat to describe your experience of this webcast study. So I'm just interested to see how are you doing? What is that descriptor for you? After we've read all the chapters, we watched so many videos. Yes, we have still a few videos to watch today and discuss the final chapters. But I'm interested to see how are you doing with all of that? What is that one word that you perhaps would use to describe? And for me, it would be one word, probably learning. And maybe the second word is eye-opening. I think I'm learning so much about the culture that I've been immersed in 13, 14 years ago that I did not know. I did not know either learning about it prior my coming to it, and I did not know while living in here. And I feel like it is because I am living in a white suburb, almost like a bubble. Thank God that I'm able to see diverse faces whenever I go out of our neighborhoods or just our place here in Powell, Ohio. But I'm thankful to learn so much about the church's failure to step up the game on speaking up against racism. Not only speaking up, but actually act. And then learning all of the horrible ways in which black and brown bodies were used and abused for economical gain, for really strange theological interpretations, to be diminished and not be seen as the children of God, up through even the year 2022. So these are kind of my opening thoughts on my experience with the webcast, with the study, with the learning, with preparation. So I'm interested to see what you're saying. Wow, you've got a lot of things going here. Thank you. And so I'm just going to name them. I'm going to name the words without naming you. So overwhelmed, thought-provoking, difficult, enlightening. Oh, and then Bev gives us a little, what else we need to read next? Measure of Men, Sidney Poulter. Thank you. Enlightening, deep, challenged, solidarity, empowered, enlightenment. There's a lot of enlightenment going on. And Larry said reflective. Thank you so much for these words. I will need to make a word cloud. Just I sometimes make word clouds, and I think it would be interesting to see the words just together clumped. And I think enlightenment will be one of the bigger words because it keeps repeating. And I understand why. The light was shed on so many events, so many stories, so many voices that perhaps were not either taught in schools, they were not mainstream, if you will, and they were not repeated and not heard. So definitely opening, and I think enlightening and almost like eye-opening. Our eyes were opened to many ways that our African American Black brothers and sisters and siblings were horribly abused in our country. And so I think this is really empowering to see our eyes open, and I think humbling as well, to look at what the church has done not have done right in response to horrible acts of racism through the ages. So we've done this amazing journey all the way from 1600s through slavery and Civil War and civil rights movements and Jim Crow and law and order, and now we are in 2022, and there's still work to be done. And so I invite you to now watch Dr. Tisby. We're going to turn to chapter 10 and talk more about especially Black Lives Matter in the context of the 21st century. And let's see what else Dr. Tisby will have to share with us tonight. So again, I invite you to open your hearts as we watch some of the last videos. Today we're actually going to watch 3 videos of Dr. Tisby. I just decided that there's a final short video that he made for that final conclusion chapter, and I thought it would be really neat to watch that last. So let's turn to Dr. Tisby and hear his wisdom.
A lot of people complain about how little progress there has been in race relations in the past 50 years. In fact, some people wonder if we've made any progress at all. Now, I think we have. For instance, in 1995, on the 150th anniversary of the denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention issued a resolution finally confessing and apologizing for its racist roots. The percentage of multi-ethnic churches, that is, any church where no group is greater than 80%, has increased to about 12.5%, which challenges the idea that Sunday at 11 a.m. is the most segregated hour in America. But there's more work to be done. I call this current phase that we're in a racialized society. And this is from Michael Emerson and Christian Smith's book, Divided by Faith. The authors define racialized as a society wherein race matters profoundly for differences in life experiences, life opportunities, and social relationships. Or, they put it another way, it's a society that allocates differential economic, political, social, and even psychological rewards to groups along racial lines that are socially constructed. So, in a racialized society, racism is subtler. It's not as obvious as slavery and actual physical chains on people, or Jim Crow, where you have signs on the wall saying, for whites only, for colored only. In a racialized society, racism is embedded in the normal operations of institutions. And it doesn't require personal bigotry or direct racial terminology to function. One of the themes that we've explored in this video series is the idea that racism never goes away, it just adapts. Now, much of the conflict between Black and white Christians comes from the failure of some to understand how race has adapted in a post-Jim Crow racialized society. Movements like Black Lives Matter, a contentious presidential election in 2016, they highlight and exacerbate these differences. Now it's a time of sharp differences and high conflict. It's also an opportunity, though, for Christians in the U.S. to reevaluate the church's role in complicity and move toward a better future. Let's talk about Black Lives Matter. On July 13th, 2013, Alicia Garza, a Black activist and writer in Oakland, California, sat down at a computer and penned what she called a love note to Black people. In this love note, she said, "Black people, I love you. I love us. Our lives matter." A friend and fellow activist named Patrice Cullors responded with a post of her own that ended in the phrase, "Black Lives Matter." Together with Opal Tometi, these two women started what became the Black Lives Matter movement. What most people don't realize is that what prompted Black Lives Matter, or BLM for short, originally was news that George Zimmerman, the man who killed Trayvon Martin in Florida in 2012, had been acquitted of all charges. Remember the Trayvon Martin case? He was a Black 17-year-old. He'd been walking back to his father's fiance's townhouse in Sanford, Florida. Reports say he had a bag of Skittles and an iced tea in his hand, and he wore a sweatshirt with a hood, otherwise known as a hoodie. Zimmerman was suspicious of Martin, pursued him against the orders of the police whom he had called, and an altercation occurred. Although the details are not precisely known, when paramedics arrived at 7:30 p.m., Trayvon Martin lay dead from a single close-range bullet to the chest. Zimmerman a year later was acquitted under Florida's Stand Your Ground law, which permits the use of lethal force if a person merely feels threatened. Black and white people viewed this incident from drastically different perspectives, partly because of that cultural toolkit we were talking about earlier. As further evidence of the divide, a Pew Research poll indicated that 49% of whites were satisfied with the acquittal verdict, but only 5% of Black people thought the same. 28% of whites agreed that Martin's death should spark more discussions on race, but 78% of Black people said it should. Now, the same divide was apparent later on with Mike Brown and his death at the hands of white police officer Darren Wilson. This happened in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. Again, the details are murky. Only one side lived to tell the tale. There was an altercation on the streets of this small town near St. Louis, and Mike Brown ended up dead. Initial reports indicated that he had his hands up in a gesture of surrender, and it spawned the chant, "Hands up, don't shoot." Now, later on, a Department of Justice report indicated that Mike Brown probably didn't have his hands up. But that's not the only report that came out. There were two reports, and the other one was focused on the Ferguson Police Department. It indicated a pattern of police abuse and misconduct. And it was in response to Mike Brown's killing that protesters took to the streets and started chanting Black Lives Matter. They took to the streets in more than 150 cities, protesting not just this incident with Mike Brown, but a pattern and a history of police brutality enacted in Black communities. And there were so many other tragic stories. You remember this period from about 2014 to 2017, and really it's ongoing of all of these human beings who became hashtags. Stephon Clark, Philando Castile, Freddie Gray, Rekia Boyd, Eric Garner, Sandra Bland. The list goes on and on and on. Black Lives Matter conveys a depth of meaning. I want to talk about two of them. Number one, Black Lives Matter serves as an assertion of the image of God in Black people. When people say Black Lives Matter, it doesn't mean that only Black Lives Matter. It means that Black Lives Matter too. Why? If you go all the way back to the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verses 26 through 28, God said, "Let us make humankind in our image and in our likeness." And those passages of scripture say that every human being, no matter their race, nationality, language, gender, or any other distinction, every person has the fingerprint of God upon them. And because of that, they are worthy of dignity. And so when people say Black Lives Matter, they're saying Black people are made in the image of God too, and should be treated that way. A second meaning of Black Lives Matter is that it functions as a cry of lament. Theologian and professor Sung-Chan Rah wrote a book called Prophetic Lament. And in it, he said, lament is a liturgical response to the reality of suffering that engages God in the context of pain and suffering. He goes on to explain that lament expresses indignation, even outrage about the experience of suffering. Black Lives Matter then presents Christians with an opportunity to weep with those who weep. In other words, to lament the fact that the lives of Black people have been systematically extinguished in so many ways throughout American history. Now, in spite of the depth of meaning of that phrase, Black Lives Matter, there have been various Christian responses to the movement. I think it's helpful, though, to make a comparison. Just as the Black Power movement was more than the Black Panther Party, which was just one organization in the midst of the broader movement, the Black Lives Matter movement is more than the Black Lives Matter organization. And we can differentiate between Black Lives Matter, the principle, the idea, the concept, and Black Lives Matter, the organization. Because many people, many Christians object to the organization because it doesn't explicitly identify as Christian, and some of the stances in terms of its platform, they would disagree with. And so because some Christians reject Black Lives Matter, the organization, they've actually distanced themselves and opposed the movement and rejected the entire concept of Black Lives Matter itself. But I think Black Lives Matter should prompt critical engagement from Christians rather than this reflexive rejection.
All right, friends. We're thankful for Dr. Tisby's wisdom. I especially appreciated the Black Lives Matter, his differentiation between the concept and movement and the organization. And I think I really appreciated that clarification. And so I wanted to talk about Black Lives Matter. When you heard that concept, what was your initial reaction to it? And then how did it change, if any, right? But especially after this learning in the book, reading the book, but also watching this video tonight, how did that change, or maybe it was only enhanced. And I think for me, I think my initial reaction when I heard Black Lives Matter, and I think I've heard it probably, it would be 2015 or 15 probably when I heard it first. But then it was with the mass protests, especially in 2020, I kept hearing them even more and more on social media and the news. And I think my initial reaction would be, of course, of course, Black Lives Matter. especially in the context of this country. And it was, to me, my personal understanding was that it's not like other lives do not matter. But because there's so much oppression and injustice related to race problem in our society, of course we need to say Black Lives Matter. But then I know when I've spoke to other people, what muddied the water, I think, is the organization. And so the clarification for me, that there is a different organization that perhaps has certain views or values that, I don't know, perhaps it's not all of the Christians that could stand behind that, right? And so then perhaps some people were reacting to that, and they were perhaps not realizing that this was also a movement and a concept of it. So I think that would be my initial reaction. So I'm interested to hear just your thoughts on that, your initial reaction on that, and how that changed or how it was enhanced perhaps. And especially with lament. I really appreciated hearing how Black Lives Matter is a lament, and is a way for Black community, right? And then white community surrounding them to lament and cry out to God, how Black and brown bodies have been battered, and so these lives, they matter so much. So let's see if you have any responses there. Mike Wolf said, I liked that Dr. Tisby said Black Lives Matter too, because all our lives matter. Right, and I think that is the point. All of our lives matter. And I think I like that. I don't know if you remember, I think the image from the very first session of the image of the Revelation, when all nations come together to glorify God. And then, of course, then go back to Genesis 1, when we were all created in the image of God. And so that all lives matter. And I know, so when people say sometimes, well, all lives matter, and that's important. But in the context of our country, with the history of deep racism that continues even through 2022, that is now deeply embedded in structures and the systems in our society, then it is especially important to say that Black Lives Matter, right? So then Kathy said, I'm sorry, friends, today I feel like a little bit, I don't know, jittery, or I'm not sure if I'm starting now to feel well or something like this. So that you hear my voice a little bit shivering, and I'm a little chilled. I'm not quite sure what's going on. I'm hoping I'm not getting sick. So I apologize for, I don't know, I'm just kind of feeling a little strange, like a little cold, and I don't know. So say a prayer for me. I don't want to get sick. I'm sorry for. Just wanted to let you know, and also I wanted to let you know, if you see a little scar here, my dog, she didn't fall. She jumped on me while I was doing yoga on the floor. She jumped from the chair right onto my forehead and even under my eyes. So I don't know if maybe you didn't even see that, but for those of you who saw that and be like, what is going on? I needed to explain that my dog basically scratched me. So anyway, that's enough of me. Let's go back to your answers. So So Kathy said, Dr. Tisby deepened my understanding of the term. Yes, thank you. Then Larry said, yes, all lives matter, but there is a needed identification of God's creative love in the specific affirmation that Black lives matter. Just as we would experience affirmation to say, my life matters. Exactly. Yeah, I fully agree with Larry. Thank you for such a beautiful articulation of that. I think you're saying some really good, beautiful words from my thoughts. Linda said, I was nervous about putting a BLM sign in my yard when my George Floyd was murdered, but thought it was important we show at least a small sign of solidarity. Yes, Linda, it's very interesting, right? So we're nervous. We are nervous about putting a little sign, or I remember there was on social media we had just the kind of a black square, right? Or put something on social media that has a hashtag Black Lives Matter. We are nervous, right? About what other people would say about us, how we're going to be perceived, right? But then, Linda, I think the key word is solidarity. That we're actually going to stand with our siblings, right? Then Robin said, I cannot honestly say all lives matter until you can say Black Lives Matter. Yes. Thank you, Robin. I fully agree with that. Diane said, objecting to Black Lives Matter because they also support gay rights is even more troubling. Double bigotry. Yes, right, Diane. So you're coming from a perspective, you're talking about the organization, and that they are working for gay rights, right? And so, again, some Christians would not agree with that theologically, so, right? And now you're saying it's double bigotry, right? Thomas said, Black Lives Matter also. Right, exactly. Dave said, I like it to any person who feels discarded and who tries to show they're important, who then gets negative feedback. They react. Yeah. Exactly. And Suzanne says, God is greater power, and his will for is love versus power to suppress is fueled by hate or fear. Yes, right. God is the greater power, and his will is for love versus power. Yes, and then hate or fear. Yes, Suzanne, thank you. And Rachel says, the Black Lives Matter movement is necessary because they have not always mattered in America. Our study highlights the exact need for this movement and how God would want us to respond. Amen. Thank you so much for your responses to that. I really appreciated it, and I think I hope we will have courage in our circles or wherever we are, then to respond, or to respond when we hear someone says, well, all lives matter, and then what would be our thoughtful response to that? And I think it seems like you have some pretty good responses here, how we would respond and stand in solidarity. I really like today the theme has this word solidarity, and I really love that. It means that we stand together as Christians. We listen to the voices that have been oppressed, that we're standing together. And how important that is, right? Because I think what we've been talking about, complicity, what we've been talking about, how the church suppressed its voice out of fear, for some economic reasons, out of fear what others might think about them, out of fear, perhaps they would not receive any financial, I guess it's economic reasons again, out of fear of losing their jobs, or out of fear. So there's a lot, I guess, that we have talked about. And why are we nervous? So we're still standing in that position, feeling nervous or feeling uncertain. What would happen if we speak up? What would happen if we actually stand with solidarity with those who are oppressed? And that's the call of justice from God to us. So thank you for your responses. We will be moving on to what Dr. Tisby is going to talk about then in chapter 11 in the video. And we'll focus on some of the ways that we can practically respond to the issues of racial injustice. And so let's hear him, what he has to say, and continue our conversation.
Throughout this survey of U.S. history, racism, and the church, we can see that although we've come a long way, we still have a long way to go. So this segment serves to present some practical ways to address the current state of racial injustice in America. Those who have humbly submitted to the tutelage of history can't help but exclaim, "I have to do something." Here's how to do it. So, whenever I give talks on racial justice, whether at a church or a conference or some other event, there's usually a Q&A at the end, and the most frequent question I ever get is, what do I do? This is from the people who understand that racism is a problem not only in the past, but still to the present day, and they want to be part of the solution. They want to know how to fight racism. Well, over time, I used to just give sort of this scattering of answers, try this, do that, here's a suggestion. I've finally developed a framework that I hope is helpful, and it's called the Arc of Racial Justice. ARC is an acronym that stands for Awareness, Relationships, Commitment. Let me break it down. So first of all, awareness. You have to know how race operates in order to be an effective anti-racist activist. In other words, you have to study the history. So doing things like following this video series is one way you can build awareness. But in general, as people in this nation, we have to do more when it comes to figuring out what has happened with racism, how it functions from a sociological and an individual perspective, and all the different ways that race and racism manifest themselves in our society. So, some practical suggestions for building your awareness. Watch documentaries. Or, my favorite answer when people ask me a question is just 2 words long: Google it. We have so much information available on the internet. It's literally at your fingertips, but there are other things that you can do to raise your awareness as well. You can take a class, whether in person or online. If I'm talking to any college students or even any graduate students, if you haven't taken a class in history, please do so, especially U.S. history, beyond whatever the requirement is. There are many other ways to build your awareness as well. You can read books, particularly books on U.S. history. Go through some of the ones that I've recommended in previous segments. You can also talk to others and get their perspectives in order to increase your awareness. So knowledge is part of what it takes to fight for racial justice. But it doesn't just stop there. We can't just have these big heads full of information and not do anything. Another aspect is relationships. So when we think about Christianity, when God wanted to reconcile humankind to himself, he didn't send an email or a memo. He didn't type a tweet or post a comment on Facebook. No, God sent a person, his son, Jesus Christ. And what that tells us is that all reconciliation is incarnational. It happens through real people communicating with one another and getting to know one another. All reconciliation then is relational. So relationships are absolutely indispensable to this work of racial justice. You got to put flesh and blood on people. We can't just study this in the abstract. We have to know folks and look in their eyes when they tell us about their racial experiences, hear the sound of their voice when they talk about their perspectives on these issues, and get to know them beyond just the stereotypes and the big blanket statements that people make about other people groups. Because when you know someone, when you care about someone, then what affects them starts to affect you. Finally, and this I think is critical, is commitment to action. You see, I think a lot of people can agree that awareness is important, and a lot of people will agree that relationships are important. In fact, they'll even say, well, listen, I treat all people the same. I try not to treat anyone better or worse because of their skin color. And in fact, I have lots of relationships with people across the color line. Something I hear a lot of times from white people is some of my best friends are Black. The idea behind that, it's well intentioned, but it's basically saying, well, since I have good individual relationships with people who are different, then I can't be part of the problem of racism. So why do I need to care about this? Well, this gets to the idea of commitment. It's the idea that racism works itself out not just through interpersonal relationships, but also through systems, structures, laws, policies, institutions. And so if we really want to commit to anti-racist action, then we have to commit to fighting the ways racism shows up in impersonal ways, not just interpersonal ways. That's this commitment. Furthermore, a commitment implies some staying power. Like, this isn't just going to go away after you watch this video or after a day, a week, or a month, but in fact, it's an entire posture. It's a way of doing life that is fundamentally oriented toward being able to spot racism wherever it shows up and then doing something about it. So the arc of racial justice has laid out a framework, a very basic framework for understanding various kinds of anti-racist actions. It's not a linear process. It's not something anyone does in order, like step 1, step 2, step 3, and it certainly doesn't end. It's a cycle that's going to continue as long as you're engaged in this work. But let's get even more practical here. So the ARC model helps us sort of conceptualize and have a framework of things. And now I want to talk about just a few ways that we can begin to address racism in the church and beyond. Now, I'll give you a heads up. These focus on more of those systemic and institutional aspects I was talking about. It's not really advice on how to build relationships across the color line. It's broader than that, gets down to affecting the systems that affect thousands of people, even the entire country. First off, let's dive right in. I think the only other R word that's more controversial among Christians than racism is the word reparations. Yeah, that one. Reparations, when people hear that, they think of just sort of writing a check to Black people as recompense for slavery. Well, I certainly wouldn't exclude that, but I would give some context to this theory and the concept of reparations. We can't talk about racial justice unless we talk about money. It's the idea that race-based chattel slavery was fundamentally an exploitative economic system. Throughout centuries of labor, enslaved Black people were not paid for their work. Not only were they not paid during their time of enslavement, this continued after the Civil War, after emancipation, and during the Jim Crow era too. For instance, they were excluded from home ownership, and your home is typically your greatest source of wealth. They were excluded from certain educational opportunities, education that could have granted them training or degrees, which could have enabled them to get jobs and positions that would have made them more secure financially. And they were prevented from taking certain jobs. We talked about in the military how Black soldiers were relegated to menial roles. They couldn't achieve many command positions and the salaries that might go with that. This happened even in the civilian realm as well, where Black people were not promoted or were excluded from certain jobs that would have enhanced their family's wealth and lead to economic advancement. And because of factors like this, generational poverty going all the way back to the antebellum era persists to this day. The wealth gap between Black and white Americans serves as an example. For every dollar in a white household, Black households have about 7 cents. Black people comprise 13% of the US population, but hold only 3% of the nation's wealth. So what do we do about this as a nation? More specifically, what do we do about this as a church? There's a Presbyterian pastor named Duke Kwan, and he talks about this concept of ecclesiastical reparations. I like this idea of ecclesiastical reparations because I think many Christians have the idea that we have to wait on politics or government to sort of pass a law or make a policy around reparations. Well, the reality is, we as the church can do something about the economic exploitation of Black people and trying to remedy the present problems that have come from this historic injustice. And there's precedence for this too. Pastor Kwan references the Old Testament and a prayer that Daniel prayed. Daniel prayed for himself and also for the people who came before him. He says he prayed for our princes and our ancestors who were covered with shame in Daniel 9:8. What that means is that even though you have not owned a slave, even though I, in my lifetime, have never been a slave in the sense of race-based chattel slavery, that we are still responsible for what people did who came before us. And we are still responsible for the ongoing repercussions and impacts of those past actions. So within Christianity, there's a sense of corporate and communal responsibility. You could apply this same idea to the idea of reparations. We simply cannot be serious about anti-racism unless we talk about that topic they tell you not to talk about, which is money, and the fact that race-based chattel slavery and its ongoing legacy has affected the financial situation of African descendants of slaves in America. So reparations, at least a conversation about it, is one practical step that we can take to bring about racial justice.
All right, we're thankful for Dr. Tisby's wisdom again in covering a bit more about what that response might be in terms of our actions to fight racism and be active in racial justice. And then he talked about reparations. So I first want to actually turn our attention a little bit on the question and the issue of reparations, and then we will talk about the arc of justice. So I'm interested to hear just your general thoughts on that, how you feel about it. Again, it's a safe space to share whatever is on your mind. It's okay. Whether you agree or disagree, feel free to share on that. I think it is an important question. And we hear about that in the news and social media. And how does that look like? I think for me, I understand that responsibility. I understand. I hear those numbers, right? Those national wealth numbers, and how much how how little of that percentage comes from the wealth of the black communities. I think it is the right thing to do. I just question how exactly. I just do not have any kind of creative ideas how that might look like. And perhaps if we're thinking about churches and communities, perhaps it might look different in every community in a unique situation that they find themselves in, like here in Powell, Ohio. And I keep thinking of Lucy Depp settlement. They're right there, just 15, 20 minutes away from us. And perhaps there is unique responses just like everywhere else, how God calls us into that place of healing and reconciliation through this action of repairing relationship, not just repenting, but then putting our words and our grief and our hearts and lament then into action. And I'm thinking about making amends in the 12-step community, and I'm just thinking what making amends is first coming and apologizing, and saying that I was wrong. But then you ask the question, how can I make it right for you? What I did is awful. So then how can I repair it? What can I do? So there's an action that comes from it. And so for me, the challenge is I just don't know how that looks like. How might that look like? And, as always, when we ask the Holy Spirit to lead us and to give us the direction, I am 100% positive that God will then empower the people to find a way, right? And then, of course, maybe the connection with the arc of justice, right? With awareness, with relationships, that is so important, right? And then the action comes. So these are just my thoughts, and I see that you have responded to the question as well. So Kathy said, I first wondered how it could work, right? And then as I learned more about the possibilities, I came to believe that there should be an exploration and discussion of it. Yeah, I agree. At least a discussion, at least a conversation, and again, how that looks like. I think Kathy and you were on the same page a little bit there. Then Linda said, I think it is the right thing to do. My concern is the topic causes some people to completely shut down and not have any sort of discussion on race. Linda, that is such a keen observation, that I think what turns people down is to say, well, I don't own slaves, or my family did not own slaves, or I personally didn't do anything, so why am I supposed to do something? So I understand the challenge of that, right? Rachel says the concept of generational poverty is really helpful when considering the need for reparations, right? When generation from generation to generation, people are not able to, lack of a better word, get out of that, of the clutches of poverty, right? They're not able to move in that ladder, right, of the American dream, supposedly. And then I'm thinking also the generational poverty and then generational trauma, right? That's big part of it as well. So Dave says, reparations means repair. So as a church, we need to examine the systems around us that limit Black involvement and seek ways we could work to repair those systems. Well, I like that perspective, Dave. So it is perhaps not a financial repayment, you're saying, right? Or maybe it is. But I think you're talking about what are those systems, right? To bring healing to the ways in which then the Black people are are not able to participate equally. And so it could be financial, but it actually, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, could be just simple. It could be not simple, but more of an action, involvement, seeking justice. Perhaps that's what you're saying, Dave. I don't know. But thank you. So then Tom said, if we wait for a national strategy, we will not live long enough. Yes, you're so right. I agree with you. It has to be local. Perhaps a percentage of a church's budget devoted to address local race-based poverty. Yeah, that's a very good idea. Karen likes your idea, Tom. And Diane and Larry Thomas likes that like that idea. So, yes, thank you so much. I think so. And I think there was another, I think that's also one of the ideas I think that Dr. Tisby talked about, right? So there is a kind of a financial support, right? And so it is financial support of educational opportunities, right? Or simply like a community engagement in a way that provides leadership opportunities for the kids that are coming from impoverished places and communities. So a way to empower and bring healing and wholeness and leadership and community engagement and just a positive impact on kids and just have relationships with them. So I don't know. Bev says, way to go, Tom. Also, time is getting away and just want to say off the subject for relationship. Could we have a combined Bible study? Bev, we have talked about it. It's a great idea. And we have talked about it. There are certain, we've been praying and thinking about it for 2 years now, to find a Black church community that we're able to be in a relationship with, to do a Bible study or to do a mission project. And it's been not easy, because there is this certain aspect of us as this all-white church coming to all Black church and saying, almost like, well, help us to learn about racism, right? Or, well, we need you. So we're trying to understand and learn and listen, and perhaps that connection with the Lucy Depp community. We've made some connections, and I'm now working on some relationships. That's where I am on Arc of Justice, to see where that goes, and perhaps there's a way for us to do Bible study. So, Bev, we will see. And then Dave said, Tom, that would be a way to work on repairs. Right, absolutely. So Bev reminded me that time is getting away from us. So I do want to ask you that one question before. And so I wonder if some of you can commit to stay, 5 minutes later today. If you can commit to that, that would be wonderful. If you have to leave, that is okay, and I understand. I will send a follow-up email, but I just put a question in the chat. When you look at the Arc of Racial Justice, and let me just put that image on the screen. Arc of Racial Justice, Awareness, Relationship, Commitment. What is that one component of that arc that you feel called for the next step for your personal journey, and why? So while you're thinking about that question, right? So again, awareness, relationships, commitment. Where do you feel the tug to go next? We've been in awareness, right? So this has been awareness. So, right, what is it? What is it? Awareness for you, or do you want to maybe work on relation? I think for me, certainly. I'm all for grabs for all three, right? I need to stay in awareness to continue to read. I think my next step where I feel the tug is definitely relationships. So exploring that for me is important. And commitment, that's definitely there. So as you're responding to this, I'm gonna remind you, and let me come back to you. Hi, I want to remind you about listening circle. I know that tonight's session perhaps might not be enough to discuss the next steps, to discuss more reactions. So that is why I've created a space for us that's called a listening circle. Sandy Huber has done that with actually several of you who are either watching now or chatting with us. And it's a safe, intentional space for us to come and listen to one another, listen to our reflections, the thoughts that we have had during the study, the next steps, right? So perhaps you're not ready to say, well, this is the next step. This is what I'm going to do. But this is intentional space for us to think through what that next step could be. How can we move forward, and kind of just gain that energy, and see and kind of listen. We are listening to one another, but we're listening also to God's Holy Spirit, to where God is leading us in this, because certainly God is leading. That is for sure. And so I know it is in person, and I thought that would be the best for the context of the study, and then just to be able to come and actually have a conversation, because we've been chatting, and it's been wonderful. I'm thankful for the way that you have adapted to this format in this kind of a harder study. And so I know that we will miss some of you. It's, if you think you're going to be missing, perhaps you can send me an email saying, hey, I will not be able to make it. I'll send you the questions that we will be talking about. And that way, I can receive your answers through just, text, and I can have that as part of our discernment process. So let me know. I sent that link to register probably a couple of days ago. But again, send me an email if you're not able to attend, and we can see what options are for us. And so again, listening circle will be August 10th at 6:00. That is what I'm talking about. So I'm trying to tell you all of this while you're also answering my question. And before we move on and to kind of close our and conclude our study. Robin said, I'm here to stay. That is great. Yes. Suzanne said, upward mobility and other programs have improved the salaries of minorities, but still the poverty of Black families lacks many in generational welfare dependency. Yes. Linda said, continued awareness. I have several books to read. Commitment, opportunities with a group of parents committed to DEI in schools. Great, Linda. Thank you. Diane says, reaching out to relationships. Yes. Rachel said, of course, all three, but relationships for me as well. I think this will make me feel even more connected to the cause. This is great. Yeah. Mike said, for continued awareness, my daughter recommends a book titled Just Mercy. Oh, yeah. Mike, I think I have that book, Just Mercy. So let me know if you need one. I think I have one here in my office. It's a great book. Robin said, the listening circle is my next step to no longer turning a blind eye. Perfect. Thank you. Karen said relationships is what I would like my next step to be. Great. Brenda said, I like where he said, create something. I would like to write a memoir for my grandchildren about my experiences with prejudice. Wow, Brenda, that is beautiful. Thank you for all these responses. And, feel free to drop your response in the chat, because we're going to go move on. I'm going to watch our final video conclusion from Dr. Tisby, and we conclude with a litany that will invite us to move forward. So let's turn to Dr. Tisby again.
Bible, in Joshua chapter 1, it begins with God telling Joshua, "Moses, my servant, is dead." In other words, Joshua, you're up. It's time for you to lead. Now you can imagine in this situation, Joshua's pretty nervous. I mean, he's got to lead hundreds of thousands of people, and he's got big shoes to fill. Moses, the man who talked face to face with God, and now it's Joshua's turn to step up. But God reassures him. 3 times in the first 9 verses of Joshua 1, it says, be strong and courageous, be strong and courageous, be strong and very courageous. Now, I'm convinced that when it comes to fighting racism in the church and beyond, we don't have a how-to problem, we have a want-to problem. Look, if I gave you a pen and paper in 5 minutes, you could probably come up with a series of ways that we could address the issue of racism in the congregation and our nation. It would be things like diversifying leadership, growing in your awareness of racial dynamics in U.S. history, all those kinds of things. It's not that we don't know how to confront racism. It's the question of will we confront racism. Over time, through years of experience traveling the country, speaking at conferences, speaking at churches all around the topic of race and the church, I've come to the conclusion that what holds us back as a church and a nation is one word: fear. Now, there's all kinds of fear. One kind of fear is what the Bible calls the fear of man, or fear of other people. We're afraid that if we take a courageous stand against racism, what are people going to say about us? What are they going to think about us? Are they going to call us names? Marxists, communists, social justice warriors, all of these things that we've seen come up time and time again in U.S. history. Or maybe more to the point, if we do confront racism in our churches, in our institutions, in society at large, what might it cost us? For many people throughout the history of the U.S. church and race, it's cost them jobs, it's cost them relationships, it's even cost their very lives. So fear is legitimate because confronting injustice in any form is risky. But I think there's another kind of fear that grips many of us, and particularly my white Christian sisters and brothers. It's the fear of getting it wrong. The fear that you don't know enough, that there's enough facts and data out there, but you don't have a firm enough grasp of it, and so you might actually make things worse if you dive into it. Well, let me reassure you. You will get it wrong. I guarantee it. But I also want to encourage you that that's really the only way to develop your effectiveness in fighting racial justice. No matter who you are, black, white, anyone else, if you want to get engaged in this work, you have to do the work. And that means you're going to stumble sometimes. It means that you're going to make mistakes. And that's okay. But I also want to encourage you that if you want to develop your effectiveness in fighting for racial justice, you got to do it. And when you do, yes, you're going to stumble sometimes. You're going to get it wrong. But guess what? That's what makes you more effective, is that you learn from your mistakes and you keep trying. So even though fear holds us back, we got to remember Joshua chapter 1 again. God says, be strong and courageous to Joshua. But then in verse 9, he also gives him a promise. Be strong and courageous and do not fear. Why? Because the Lord is with you wherever you go. Now here's the amazing thing. In the Old Testament, God gives Joshua a promise. In the New Testament, he gives to the church a person. His name is Jesus Christ. You might know him also as Emmanuel, which means God with us. So now, through faith in Jesus Christ, we have the indwelling of the Holy Spirit by the will of God the Father to go out and fight racial injustice wherever we might see it, whether it's in the church or the society at large. It means that he who is within us is greater than he who is outside and opposing us. It means that you don't have to have fear as you engage in this work of racial justice, but you can walk forward in faith that God is with you wherever you go. It's time to stop compromising with racism in the American church, and it's time to courageously confront it.
Amen. What an empowerment Dr. Tisby gave to us a reminder to be strong and courageous, for God is with us. So to conclude our time together in our study, I know there's lots to talk about and process together. First, come to the listening circle. Second, reach out to me and to others in this group to keep the conversation going. Third, keep praying. And fourth, be strong and courageous. So I invite you, if you are able to, wherever you are, if you're able to speak these words of litany with me, especially to speak the bolded parts for you, I invite you to respond to all the information that we have received, right? For all the reflections that we have had, the questions that we still have in our heads, the wonderings, the excitement, perhaps the nervousness and the fear. Bring it all into our hearts and our minds here and hold it. And so now, bring it all before God, before Jesus. And let's say this prayer together. Be strong and courageous. God is with us. To learn, to build relationships, to act justly. Be strong and courageous. God is with us. To come alongside our brothers and sisters of color, to listen to their voices and their stories. Be strong and courageous. God is with us. To stop the Christian church's complicity in racism and fight racism every day. Be strong and courageous. God is with us to be the people of hope and light, to be the people of justice and truth. O holy God, we commit ourselves to the hard work to continue to fight racism, to open up ourselves up for your holy work in and through us. Regard the black and brown bodies as your beloved children made in your image, sacred and precious. Stand beside them with solidarity and compassion. Grant us wisdom. Grant us courage for the living of these days. And help us be strong and courageous, for you are with us. Amen. Amen. Friends, thank you so much for your commitment, for that step of awareness, for learning, for commitment of your time. Thank you so much for your honesty, for the sacred space that you all have created here. And I wanted to continue that conversation, to keep the conversation going, as in different spaces, in different days in the future. So may God's blessing be upon us as we go into the world, and we're going to be strong and we're going to be courageous. And we will not be afraid because God is with us and God goes before us. So thank you again. Have a good night and the rest of your summer. I will see many of you in listening circle or here around the church or online or in some other matter. Thank you so much again, and blessings again to you. Thank you.